Welcome on behalf of the International Institute for Peace. I want to welcome to this IIP Talks. I'm Heinz Gärtner. I'm chairing the board of the International Institute for Peace. Today's topic will be the Middle East and the Persian Gulf region. This area has been largely overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. So it briefly came back to the limelight when US President Biden visited the region and spoke to the Israeli Prime Minister and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and attended a meeting by the Gulf Cooperation Council and talked also to the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. We had another meeting there. 3 presidents met the president in Tehran, President Raisi of Iran, and President Putin from Russia, and also President Erdogan from Turkey. Less noticed by the public was another visit by the High Representative of the European Union, Josep Borrell, in Tehran. He met with the Iranian Foreign Minister, Amir Abdollahian, and they talked about how to revive the JCPOA, and short after, there have been some talks in Doha about the JCPOA very briefly. So this is the background we are going to speak about today. We have a very, very qualified expert today. I'm really glad that Professor Shireen Hunter accepted to speak to us at the IIP Talk. She is a professor at Georgetown University. She had a diplomatic career as well. She worked in the Iranian Foreign Service between 1965 and 1979, but she also served at several think tanks. She was program director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, but also before that worked at the Center for European Policy Studies. Since then, she had several types of professorships at Georgetown University, and she's an honorary fellow and professor at Georgetown. Shireen Hunter published and edited about 30 above books, and wrote hundreds of articles, mainly on the region, the Persian Gulf region, about Iran and the Middle East. Welcome, Shireen, to our talks. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Let me first ask you, which is the background of this visit by President Biden in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords. They have been signed about 2 years ago by then US President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, together with 2 Arab states, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And it was in the public, we heard about it was about cooperation between Israel and Arab states in the areas of economy and culture. But if you listen to Israeli officials, they continuously speak about an alliance. The Abraham Accords, an alliance against the common threat of Iran. Also, when President Biden visited Saudi Arabia, there's plenty of evidence that he wanted to convince Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords as well. At least he wanted to establish an integrated defense system based on the members of the Abraham Accords, but also with including of Saudi Arabia. So, Shireen, my first question is, are the Abraham Accords a strategic alliance in emerging? And second, what is the problem with Saudi Arabia? Why does Saudi Arabia not join yet the Abraham Accords?
Well, first of all, Heinz, let me thank you for asking me to share a few minutes with you and discuss these various aspects of what's going on in the Middle East. I think that Abraham Accords, in essence, is the continuation of efforts that the U.S. basically has undertaken since the 1970s, and especially, after the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, to try to reconcile Israel and Arabs. Initially, the U.S. attitude in this regard was the kind of assume the role of a mediator and to try to reach an agreement that not only served Israel's security and but also addressed some of the basic grievances of Arabs and especially the Palestinians. However, gradually, I think that I suppose the last big effort in this regard, in mediation regard, even though U.S. was not directly involved in it, it was the Oslo Accords that gave us all a lot of hope that, in fact, we might see the Palestinian issue be resolved in a way that was acceptable both to the Palestinians, to the Israelis, and also the broader Arab public. And that was obviously essentially based on a two-state solution. However, that Oslo Accords became what I call dead on arrival, and that major culprit for that was, of course, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which I think was perhaps the Israeli leader most willing to reach a compromise with the Palestinians. What we saw after that was basically a drift in U.S. policy. Clinton tried to do acting in 2000 to reach some agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and even though apparently agreement was quite close, but finally it didn't go anywhere, and both sides blamed the other. So what happened with Trump? Trump basically said, let's forget about the Palestinians and let's start first to create relations, economic relations, cultural relations, and also political relations between Israel and those Arab states willing to do so. And I think that this was the foundation of the eventually agreement that eventually came to be known as the Abraham Accords. And the countries that bought into this Abraham Accords, of course, were Bahrain, and then were the UAE and Morocco. And if I am not wrong, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think eventually Sudan as well, yes, under the pressure of the United States. So basically, this has been now the U.S., instead of being an honest broker and mediator, has essentially been acting as an assistant to Israel in order to get it accepted in the Middle East. And that once the goal ultimately is that once all the Arab states have relations with Israel without any reference to Palestinians or to the rights of the Palestinians or the idea of two-state solution, then the Palestinian will give up and will have to accept whatever that Israel is willing to give them in terms of limited autonomy and so on. So this is really the essence of the Abraham Accord. Accords. Now, since the Abraham Accords were agreed upon, things have evolved, and certainly Israel is trying to use the Abraham Accords as a foundation for a broader security and defense arrangement between itself and the Arab states, and of course, with a focus on the Persian Gulf Arabs. But let's not forget others. I mean, Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan has peace treaty with Israel. So I think Israel would like to get them all. But since the defense alliances basically, as you know better than I do, require a common enemy to become consolidated. So throughout, the Israelis have used the estrangement between Iran and some of the Arab countries, especially some of the Persian Gulf Arab states and Saudi Arabia, as the glue that this should keep together this sort of incipient alliance, as they call it. Now, however, I think that some Arab states in general, deep down, have reservations about this. And even though they are not saying anything about Palestinians, and certainly the Palestine issue has lost the salience that it had, certainly when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s and those years, and even up into the 80s and so on. But I think that there is it does resonate with some Arab populations and even some Muslim populations. So there is still a tendency among some Arab states, so to speak, to hedge their bets. For example, Israel was very eager, and the US also wanted that Oman should join this process of normalization with Israel. And although Oman has always had, basis of Oman's policy has been that they want to have good relations with all countries in the region, which included also Israel. But Omanis were not willing to establish open diplomatic relations with Israel. I imagine that part of this, because Oman also has close relations with Iran and is much closer to Iran geographically, that might have been one aspect of it. But I also think that the whole Palestine issue is not completely irrelevant. At the same thing, Qatar so far, even though, again, it has been eager for some time now, or at least 10 years or so, to have informal relations with Israel. So far has not joined this Abraham Accord. And then we come to the question of Saudi Arabia. And MBS, of course, in many, many occasions has indicated that it believes that it's in the interest of Saudi Arabia to have some kind of a strategic agreement with the Israelis. Some Persian Gulf Arab states see Israel as potentially a source of military support and also as perhaps a good commercial and economic partner. And Israel, of course, really is eyeing the money and the markets of the Gulf Arab states. Now, Saudis, MBS has two problems. One is that King Salman, even though in poor health and apparently, fading, and his mental powers are not as strong as they were, still is the king, still is the leader of Saudi Arabia. And he is of a generation that the Palestine issue, not necessarily because of Palestinians' national rights, but because of the Islamic considerations, and is important for him. The other thing is that Saudi Arabia wants the leadership of the Muslim world, at least the spiritual leadership of the Muslim world. And in this regard, of course, they are in competition also with Iran. And the idea that openly and completely to give up on Palestine and on Jerusalem and let the Israelis run the Masjid al-Aqsa or so on is, I think, still probably the Saudis feel that it's a little bit a bridge too far. But I also have a feeling that they may want to have all kinds of other concessions, especially from the United States, regarding regional issues, a promise that they will defend Saudi Arabia, maybe promise that they will recognize MBS once the King Salman dies, in terms of legitimize Saudi Arabia, MBS's kingship. So they are, I think, maybe also bargaining, I think, so they're holding back a little bit to see what more they can get. But the idea that I think the Abraham Accords could be turned into what in some of the media has been referred to as an Arab-NATO, I find that a little bit too exaggerated. If nothing else, is that some of these Persian Gulf Arab states, certainly the members of the GCC, they are very close to Iran. I mean, it's, I don't know, to half an hour to go from Bahrain by some small boat to the Iranian shore and so on. And certainly, of course, in the case of any military conflict, Iran is going to be damaged more than anyone else. But I also have a feeling that this particular, leadership in Iran will also then want to do whatever it can to damage others. And so if there is a war, whether it's initiated by Israel or by accident or by the US, I think that the people, the countries that are going to be damaged more, in addition to Iran, of course, are going to be the Gulf states. I mean, Iran, if we accept all this opinion that Iran has the largest missile capability and now drone capability. If we accept this analysis, I am myself a little bit skeptical, but if we accept it, then obviously they're going to use this. They're going to use this to inflict damage and pain. So
I will come to this back a little later, the use of force in the Middle East. But I want to stay a little bit with the Palestinians now before we lose this topic.
That's right.
There was a declaration between President Biden and Prime Minister Lapid, which mentions the Palestinians at the very end, that it condemns terrorist attacks on Israeli officials. And there is no reference to a two-state solution. It just says that both peoples deserve to live in with freedom and prosperity. That's a very generic formula. President Biden spent some lip service to the two-state solution, at the same time saying now it's not feasible. President Biden did not abandon this so-called Kushner plan, the plan by Trump's son-in-law, which leaves the Palestinians with a scattered territory, with no sovereignty, pay for their own security, but the security remains with the Israelis. So it doesn't mention a state at all, because Kushner said Palestinians are not able to lead a state. So President Biden did not really away with this Kushner plan. President Obama still referred to the borders of 1967. He was very heavily criticized by Prime Minister Netanyahu at that time, and then he didn't mention it anymore. So a two-state solution would require recognition of the 1967 borders. But what does President Biden mean when he speaks about two-state solution? What is the policy about the Palestinians by the Biden administration? Where is the difference to the Trump administration? Is there that much difference here? So,
No, there is not much difference. I mean, I think that one thing we have to realize is that always the Arab-Israeli conflict and the whole Palestinian issue had a domestic dimension in America. In other words, it was the influence of the pro-Israel elements and so on that had a great impact. Now, this impact has increased in the last several decades. And so I think that it has now become such that both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, essentially do what Israel wants on this issue and on many other issues related to the Middle East. And so my belief is that, in fact, my belief is that since 1980, after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and when there was not a really rapid follow-up in doing something about the Palestinians, whether it was the autonomy talks then and then later on, of course, we went to Oslo Accords and so on. My deep, firm belief is that the Israelis are bound and determined they're never going to give back anything of the West Bank. That I think that everybody has to accept. Now, if you want to have a Palestinian state so that you can say that, okay, we kept our promise and there is Palestinian state, my feeling is that that will be limited to someplace like in Gaza or maybe a few outposts. But I don't think that anything, I think this is really finished, I think, to do. It's almost like a torturing the Palestinians to still continue to talk about the two-state solution. There's not going to be possible. And domestically in Israel also, it's not going to be possible. I think, for example, and every day that Israel builds more settlements, it becomes more difficult. And this has been going on, as I say, at least for, 40 years now. It has been continuously going on. And nobody has done anything to stop the settlement. Right now, I don't think that the US will be able to do that. In the 1970s and even the beginning of the 80s, this was possible. But now with the dynamics after the Iranian Revolution, the dynamics have changed. And so I am very pessimistic that anything can be done on the Palestinian issue. And Biden, of course, you have to realize that actually the influence of pro-Israel elements in Democratic Party is even more to some degree, although Republicans have caught up on this, than in the Republican Party. And so everything is electoral politics. And so the reason why President Biden didn't say anything about the Palestinians, to begin with, I don't think he has much empathy for Palestinians. He thinks in political terms. He's a politician. He thinks about next election and what's going to be happening in the next elections. I think this is so ingrained now in American political system. Now, Obama, I think, was a different person. Let's not forget that Obama was the son of African man. So Obama was very aware of the whole colonial issues and colonial past and so on. And he also had, was a more educated man. I don't mean just having degrees from university and so on. He had educated himself also about the politics of this issue. He had known some prominent Palestinian intellectuals, like Rashid Khaledi and others and so on. So he really wanted to have a balanced policy in the Middle East, including, for example, in the Persian Gulf. His famous saying that Iran and Saudi Arabia should learn to share the region, I think. But even Obama was constrained by the political dynamics. So I think that I don't see anyone that going to come, whether Republican or Democrat, that's going to do anything. There's no, they don't feel any necessity to do that. The Palestinian issue in the old days, like even 1970s, people would worry that the Palestinian issue could lead to some kind of crisis in the US-Soviet relations, for example. And so that it was linked with the broader Cold War dynamics. We don't have that anymore. I mean, Russia is in Syria and so on, but Russia of today is not the Soviet Union, and they don't really care about this stuff. So I unfortunately have to say that great sadness that I don't, if I were a Palestinian, I wouldn't, expect much to happen. I hope I am wrong. You can never be sure because dynamics changes, but at the moment, I think that's the way.
So obviously the Palestinians didn't play much of a role in the visit by Biden in the Middle East. What played a role was oil. We cannot avoid to address this issue. And of course, President Biden wanted to convince Bin Salman to increase oil production to compensate Russian oil, destabilize the oil prices because he's afraid of increasing gasoline prices at home as well. So he ignored all the human rights issues, what he addressed before, and the democracy issues, and his alliance for democracies. So Saudi Arabia obviously does not qualify for this alliance. So geopolitics and economics and oil matter more. But my question is an unusual question. We do have the JCPOA. And if the JCPOA would be implemented, Iran and the sanctions would be lifted, Iran would be free to sell its oil, and it would be plenty to compensate Russian oil and stabilize oil prices. So it would be a multilateral and not a bilateral solution, because the JCPOA is a multilateral agreement. So the best thing would have been to push for the conclusion of the JCPOA a long time ago. And so my question is a little bit provocative. So why is Saudi oil better than Iranian oil? So what would you, why not JCPOA and why Bin Salman?
Well, I think that you just said it yourself. You said it's geopolitics. And as you know, I am a realist and I'm a believer that always politics and power in the final analysis overcome any other moral scruples, including concern for human rights violations and so on. This, unfortunately, is the way the human nature works. Problem is that I have always said this, the Iran issue goes beyond the oil and even nuclear program of Iran is the question of what to do with Iran. That's what it is basically. And this has been going on for quite a long time. And US has made a lot of mistakes. The thing is that, again, in this regard, the domestic politics in America is very important. The Israeli factor is very important. I don't know if you recall that actually Netanyahu boasted that he convinced Donald Trump to exit the JCPOA, even though his foreign his Secretary of State at the time, Tillerson, was against it. So I think that this is basically what it is, that the containment of Iran and the regional influence of Iran is more important. And of course, one thing we have talked, the JCPOA was never about the Iran nuclear issue solely. This was to be the kind of the opening for doing other things. And a lot of people in the US are opposed and were opposed. The regime changers are very, very strong in the US political body. And you look at some of the initiatives in Congress, some Republican lawmakers trying to make it more difficult to do anything with Iran, including. And of course, the oil issue is that Iran will get more money, and then they would become stronger and so on. Because the ultimate aim of some of these groups, including in US and in Israel, is to exacerbate the inherent contradictions of the Islamic regime, which is already there. I mean, we see that the crisis coming. And that to lead to some sort of either collapse of the political power and possibly even some kind of internal conflict and so on, which eventually could lead to a change of regime. And I think that some of Iran's neighbors, I know some people will think that I'm exaggerating or whatever, but I think that the Israelis, I think the Turks, and certainly the Arab states would like Iran to disintegrate. I think that they share in Saddam Hussein's wish that Tariq Aziz, his prime minister, said that we prefer 5 small Irans to 1 big Iran. And things that are happening, with Turkey, stuff that Turkey is doing in the Caucasus and the whole pan-Turkish push. And of course, you have, I don't want to just make it a one-sided thing, then you have the Iranian scene. In Iran now, we have the hardliners, which in my opinion, may be wrong, which in my opinion are completely divorced from what the regional and international realities they really are. And they are bound and determined that in the face of growing challenges, instead of becoming more realistic and more flexible, including talking to Americans. I mean, you cannot not to talk to one of the key players on the international scene. They talk to everybody. They talk to China, and China is not exactly a model of humanity and democracy or whatever. They talk to Russia, despite what they see Russia is doing in Ukraine, but they refuse to talk to America. So I think that you have in Iran also this hardline group, and that they also see JCPOA as the beginning of the end. In other words, if JCPOA is revived, then the Americans are going to ask for other things, they're going to ask to talk, and then that would be the beginning of the end for the regime and for the hardliners. So, and this has always been the case. So I always say that the nuclear thing is a symbol of all the problems, other fundamental problems that exist between Iran and the West. And so that the idea that whoever was, that both Iran and the US made a miscalculation by thinking that JCPOA is going to be the roadway to, because unfortunately the internal politics of Iran is deeply connected to its external relations, and certainly the fear, I mean, of the hardliners in Iran is that establishment of U.S.-Iran relation, which they see as the end of Islamist government.
So, what is an alternative then? So, the common declaration of Prime Minister Lapid and Biden says we want to prevent that Iran will acquire nuclear weapons by all means necessary, which of course includes the use of force. And President Biden likes to speak about the last resort. The Israelis likes to speak
about the first choice.
Of the option B, which is a military option. So there is a military option. So, but that it implies that Iran is striving for a nuclear weapon state. But if you look at the JCPOA in the preamble of the JCPOA clearly states that Iran never will acquire nuclear weapons. So the JCPOA would be basically the best document to prevent this. So we would not need this option B or the last resort and the military option if the JCPOA would be implemented. So you are saying more or less nobody wants, let's put it that way, the hardliners and the hawks on both sides, they don't want the JCPOA and they try everything to prevent it. But that would leash basically an escalation in the Middle East, because that would imply the threat of the use of force by Israel. Israel would want to involve the United States. It would be a real destabilizing situation. So the best way to prevent this, and what the declaration requires, would be the JCPOA. So paradoxically.
That's right. I couldn't agree more with you. You just explained it very clearly in a nutshell. But the thing is that the nuclear issue is a pretext, this I have been saying for at least several years, to weaken Iran. I don't know whether the US has bought into, I don't think the American, politicians, or most of them anyway, or professional diplomats think in those terms, but the Israelis certainly think. The question basically is for Israel to completely ruin Iran in the sense that it will no longer be an actor. If you look at the policies that has been pursued, Egypt was essentially what I call defanged, by the Camp David Accords and the peace treaty. Egypt is no longer a viable, in a way, actor as such in the Middle East. I mean, they try to, they go here and there and get some money from Gulf Arabs and somebody, nobody is looking to them, even Qatar. Because they have their own disagreements. Qatar prefers Turkey rather than Egypt to come and establish relations. So Egypt has been out of the equation for a long time. Then, of course, and there is increasing evidence that the Israel factor was very important in the decision to go and invade Iraq, including some recent statement by Tony Blair and all that. So then, therefore, Iraq is now a mess. I think whether Iraq can be put together is a mess. Iraq, for all practical purposes, is already divided. The Kurdish area is no longer responding to Baghdad and all these others. Syria is also a mess. For practical purposes, it is a mess. Humpty Dumpty will not be put together again. Bahrain and the UAE are not serious countries. I mean, it is just they're just like little entrepôts for trade and other things. Saudi Arabia, yes, especially has the potential to be a significant country. Sudan is divided. Libya is divided for all practical purposes. So when you look around Israel, the only country, despite all its weaknesses and it getting worse and worse, that still is an actor and still, despite all its problems, has some potential, is Iran. And I don't believe that Israel will allow that to remain. And so it's the whole, let's face it, the Israelis, for some, at least since 1993, I remember Shimon Peres constantly used to say Iran is 6 months away from a nuclear bomb. And we've been now more than 30 years and nothing happened. So the bomb is not the point. It's just, my own cynical view is, perhaps I shouldn't say cynical, realistic view is that what the Americans now want and what the Israelis want, although this, changes in the region and internationally might change the view, is neither war nor restoration of JCPOA. Because this currently suits their interests. I mean, if Iran normalized relations with the US, how could Israel say Iranian threat so that get all these contracts from the Gulf Arabs and sell its weapons and Iron Dome or whatever else that it is? So the whole idea of having Iran there as a kind of a bogeyman is very useful for them. And so I think that it's useful for the MBZ, it's both for even MBS. MBS is a little different because the folly of MBS into going into Yemen and all the problems has been different. But so my feeling is that essentially they're not going to allow this. I feel that I honestly do believe, and I may be wrong, this is just an opinion, it's not a scientifically based, I haven't researched this particular aspect. It's just an opinion. But I do believe that even if today Khamenei retired and we had Ahmad Khomeini there and had asked for all kinds of reforms and even change openly its position on Israel, I don't think Israelis will accept that. They need this, they need an enemy, and they need an enemy that also is the enemy of the US. So I think that the biggest opponent of reconciliation, and it's nothing that I'm saying it new. I wrote it in my book that was published in 2010. None of the regional actors want US-Iran reconciliation, including Turkey. Turkey has its own ambitions, and so the problem of Iran is, and of course this is the revolutionaries did that to themselves, but at all events, the Americans did not help the Iranian moderates. They refused to deal with them. And I think that I followed all this sitting in Washington in CSIL, and that a major element was both the Israelis, but also the Arabists within the State Department and in the broader thing. And I know some of them personally, Yeah.
We have to, at that sober note, Shireen, we have to leave it there. It was fascinating. Thank you so much for your realistic, succinct, clear thoughts. We will continue on that in due time. Thank you again for participating and give us your view and your analysis. Wonderful. Thank you, Shireen.